I made a video about how the Mexica, the people many call Aztecs, might have come from what is now modern-day Utah. In an Instagram reel I made for the video, about a third of the over 3,000 comments that I got said, well, that's because, Andrew, Utah was Mexico and it always has been. But then there was another camp that said, no, Utah was only Mexico for a short period of time, and before that, it was something else entirely. So was the land that Mexico lost to the US always Mexico, or is it more complicated than a map and a border? That's what we're going to look at today. I definitely have my opinion, and I'll share that at the end. But I thought to myself, let's trace that idea from the time the Mexica leave their sacred homeland, through Spanish rule, the birth of independent Mexico, and the moment the US-Mexico border was drawn in the 19th century. And by the end, you tell me, was it really Mexico? Let's go. Way before maps showed the word Mexico in them, the lands from California to Texas and deep into what's the American Southwest were already home to entire indigenous worlds. Ancestral Puebloans, Hohokam, Mogollon, Casas Grandes, Patayan, Otomi, and many others each had their own languages, names, culture, god, food, long before the name Mexico existed. Now, long before the arrival of the Spanish, there were the people called the Mexica, people that most people now still call Aztecs, and they told stories of an ancient homeland called Aztlán. But according to Nahua tradition, we have to remember, Aztlán wasn't just the homeland of the Mexica. It belonged to 7 tribes, often called the Nahua Chichimeca peoples. Each of those nations would go on to shape central Mexico's history. But when the Mexica, who were the last to leave Aztlán, according to folklore, in about the year 1111 AD or CE for those of you who are scientists, none of them were leaving Mexico. They were leaving a much older world. Deserts, rivers, canyons, and all things that had existed long before there was an idea of any country. Now, codices described Aztlán as a place of whiteness, herons, a place of water and reeds. Their god, Huitzilopochtli, commanded the Mexicas to leave it all behind and search for a new home that they would find after following certain signs. So they began a long migration south, through lands that stretch across northern Mexico and possibly as far up as the US Southwest. For more than 2 centuries, generation after generation of Mexica moved through those deserts and valleys, until in 1325, they finally founded Tenochtitlan 214 years later. Now, all of this would happen in a world without Mexico, without borders, without even a name for what Mexico would eventually become. That would come later. So when people say those lands were Mexico, those lands existed before Mexico. Now we take a big jump in time to about the year 1325, listed as the official founding of Mexico Tenochtitlan, the city that would become the heart of their world. From that lake area in the Valley of Mexico, they built alliances, expanded their power, and formed as what's known as the Triple Alliance with the city-states of Texcoco and Tlacopan. And together they built an empire that stretched across much of central Mesoamerica. Some city-states joined them willingly, others were conquered. They traded with some nations and kept their distance from others, like the Purépecha from Michoacán, who were powerful enough to hold their own against the Mexica's armies. By the 1500s, the Mexica ruled vast areas of what we now consider Mexico, but their reach stopped well short of what we consider now the US-Mexico border. Now, north of the Valley of Mexico were entirely different nations, the Yaqui, Pima, Puebloan, and many more, each with their own languages, alliances, and their own traditions. They were independent, sophisticated, and not under Mexica rule. Now, to the Mexica, their world wasn't about borders on a map. It was about water, trade, and connection. They called their homeland Anahuac, the land between the waters. At first, this meant the lakes around Tenochtitlan. Later, the word Anahuac described their broader world tied together by shared gods, markets, and stories. So even if the Mexica may have begun their journey from up north, their empire, their Mexico, was built in the south. So were the areas of California, Arizona, Utah, New Mexico part of the Mexica Empire? No, not politically and not geographically. The influence of the Mexica did reach pretty far, but not that far. Now, the Mexica ruled one of the most powerful civilizations in all of the Americas. But that was about to change forever, because in 1519, ships appeared on the eastern horizon. And with them came people who didn't want to just trade or explore. They came to conquer. And within just a few years, everything that defined the Mexica world, their alliances, their temples, their gods, would be replaced by something entirely new. After the fall of the Mexica in 1521, the world that had been theirs gave way to the world of La Nueva España, New Spain. This wasn't the country of Mexico, not yet. It was a colony, ruled from across the ocean. Power flowed from Madrid through a viceroy in Mexico City. People who lived in New Spain didn't call themselves Mexican, todavía no. They were Spanish subjects or indigenous, or placed somewhere inside a rigid caste system that defined their worth by blood, birthplace, and faith. And yes, those colonial borders stretched far north into Alta California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and parts of Utah, Nevada, and Colorado. But on the ground, most of that world would still be controlled by indigenous nations, who had never been conquered. Spanish missions and military garrisons called presidios appeared like distant outposts, but their reach was limited and fragile. So was it Mexico? It was Spain, and now it was wearing a new name. A world of a new faith, conquest, and control that would last nearly 3 centuries until the idea of Mexico finally took shape. In 1821, New Spain became independent from La Madre Patria. A short-lived Mexican empire gave way to a Mexican republic. But let's backtrack a little, because before then, Mexico didn't mean the whole nation. During Spanish rule, it referred mainly to the Valley of Mexico and the great city built atop Tenochtitlan. The Spanish kept using the name Mexico, well, their version of Mexico, because it was already known throughout the region. Over time, Mexico became shorthand for the political and religious center of New Spain, but not for the vast lands up north, like California or Texas, or what would become New Mexico. But when independence came, the new leaders decided to call the whole nation Mexico, a deliberate and symbolic choice that expanded the meaning of the word from one valley to an entire country. Now, to be specific, at first, it was El Imperio Mexicano, the Mexican Empire, and later on, Los Estados Unidos Mexicanos, the United Mexican State. They chose the name Mexico because the name already carried centuries of weight, linking the new republic to the Mexica heartland, the colonial capital, and its indigenous roots all at once. And then suddenly, on maps, Mexico was a massive territory, and for the first time, Mexicano became a national identity meant to include everyone within those borders. But identity takes time. Many people still saw themselves as they always had: Maya, Rarámuri, Nahua, Yaqui, Comanche, or Spanish-descended settlers who barely knew what we call Mexico City, like the faraway Californios. You can imagine where they lived. On paper, the northern lands were now Mexico. But in reality, Mexico City was very far away and its presence was stretched very thin. By the 1830s, Mexico's hold on its northern frontier was stretched even thinner. The region of Texas was legally part of Mexico, but many settlers there were migrant newcomers from the United States, Europe, and other parts of the world. Few spoke Spanish, followed Mexican laws, or thought of themselves as Mexican. And in 1836, those settlers declared independence, calling themselves the Republic of Texas. Many had arrived barely a decade earlier, yet they demanded autonomy. There were also Tejanos, familias with deep roots in the region, both indigenous and Spanish descended, who stayed loyal to Mexico. Their voices rarely make it into the simplified versions of this story, but they were there, fighting for the country they still believed in. And they did see themselves as Mexicanos. By this point, Mexico City was severely thin on resources and facing constant conflict with powerful indigenous nations like the Comanche and Apache, who controlled much of the lands of the north. So when the United States recognized Texas' independence and annexed it in 1845, Mexico saw it as a provocation, and that was the spark that would soon ignite a war. The war between Mexico and the United States from 1846 to 1848 changed everything. Leading Mexico at the time was General Antonio López de Santa Anna, a name you might have heard before. Remember the Alamo? That Santa Anna. He'd been exiled, brought back, and somehow ended up leading the country again. He was president 11 times between 1833 and 1855, during the absolute chaos that was the post-independence era for Mexico. And here in Mexico, he's either celebrated or despised, depending on who you ask. And by the time that war broke out, Mexico was broke, divided, and upside down. When it ended, Mexico lost almost half its land. Through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, the United States took possession of what are now California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming in exchange for $15 million. But the word exchange doesn't really capture what happened. The treaty was signed while U.S. troops still occupied Mexico City. So Mexico had no leverage, and it was either sign or else. And just a few years later, Santa Anna made one more deal, selling even more land to the United States. That was the Gadsden Purchase of 1853, $10 million for a strip of what's now southern Arizona and New Mexico. That sale finalized the borders we have today. For the people who had lived in those lost areas, families who'd lived through years of Mexican law found themselves in a new country without ever leaving home. And that time period gave us a saying that we still hear today. We didn't cross the border. I think you can finish that for me, can't you? So I think here's where perspective really matters. Legally, the lands that were lost to the United States were legally part of the country of Mexico for only about 27 years, from 1821 to 1848. Before that, they were New Spain, and after that, they became part of the United States. But culturally, it's a completely different story. Spanish had been spoken here for centuries. Catholic traditions took root, and beneath all of it, indigenous heritage never stopped living, breathing, or shaping everyday life. When the border moved, it didn't erase identity. People stayed, families stayed, and their languages, food, and faith stayed. Borders changed, people didn't. Look at the names all across the U.S. Southwest: Los Angeles, Santa Fe, San Antonio, El Paso, Nevada, Colorado. Every one of them tells a story. It's in the architecture, the food, the music, and you can feel it in the mix of identities there layered over time. Indigenous roots first, Spanish influence next, and Mexican culture woven through it all. That connection didn't vanish when the border moved, it just became more complex and layered. So, was it Mexico? Here's what I think. I think it's some of both. It was formerly Mexico only for a short time, but the ties run far deeper than just borders. What makes a place Mexico, or any place really, isn't paperwork. It's people, traditions, and stories that are passed down from generation to generation. So what do you think? Share your take in the comments. I really do read every single one of them. And remember, it was those comments who made this series possible in the first place. Now, our story of Aztlán still isn't finished. Next on our Searching for Aztlán series, we're heading over to Nayarit, a place many believe is the real Aztlán. And what's there could change our idea of everything. If you want to help me keep making these stories, the links to the merch store and the Amazon store are down below. And please know I get a small commission from those sales, but that doesn't affect your price at all. And if you're new here, welcome. Consider subscribing and joining our growing circle. Friend, thanks for joining us again. I'm Andrew, and these are the mysteries. Y hasta la próxima. Adiós.